Q&A, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of this discussion. Let me say also a big thank you to Alison Steiber of the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics for making all of this happen, working with Dan Ryden for organizing this event. So last year, the School Meals Coalition was created by 73 countries as a way of thinking about how they were going to respond to the COVID pandemic, to all those schools that had closed and all of those school meals that had not been delivered, and how to recover from that, how to rebuild from that. And when the coalition was created, the NIH, along with USDA and the research consortium for school health and nutrition, discussed the lack of a clear picture on the importance of nutrition in school-age children in adolescence. And this prompted NIH to create this, to use their BOND platform, the Biomarkers of Nutritional Development platform that they developed some 10 years previously for much younger children, to develop it again along the lines of thinking about school-age children and adolescents. Now, the School Meals Coalition group of 73 countries had come up with 3 goals by then. One was to restore programs back to where they'd been before the pandemic. The second was to reach the 73 million children that had never been reached through these programs. And the third was to improve the quality of programs. Well, this week we've heard how the restoration goal is well underway. We hear of very exciting new initiatives in Rwanda, in Benin, in Senegal, really supporting growth in these areas. And we hear that many of the surveys that have been done suggest that we are now starting to get back towards covering the 400 million children, that's 1 in 2 of the world's school-age children, through these school-based programs. So goal 1 is in hand. We also have heard how the Sustainable Finance Initiative of the School Meals Coalition is leading the way on looking at financing for the 73 million, with the help of many of the UN agencies, especially with the World Food Programme. And the final part of this picture, the final goal, is about raising the quality of nutrition in school meals, of understanding the needs, of understanding the problems, and also suggesting the solutions. And it's that area that the NIH have been really focusing on through their Bond Kids platform. And so what we're going to cover today is how that work has moved forward. And I should acknowledge the role of the multi-agency steering committee in helping direct that area of work. So today we're going to hear in today's session what was done and what are the findings as we begin to move forward. So we've got a stellar panel of experts to speak with us. I think we're starting with the contribution from NIH, and I think this is going to be given by Drew Bremer, the Division Chief of Pediatrics, Growth and Nutrition. And Drew is going to talk to us about the Bond Kids concept. Over to you, Drew.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Don, and I want to echo Don's welcome to everyone, wherever you are in the world today. I hope you're safe. I hope you're well. I hope your families are safe and well. And thank you for tuning in. I also want to acknowledge Alison Steiber and her team from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics for just an extraordinary help in this project, and also for running the slides because I'm technically challenged. And so with that, yeah, Alison, if you wouldn't mind, what you all will be seeing is and what I hope to do in the next few minutes is just kind of give an overview. But I'm going to take this opportunity because, as you see on the bottom right of that slide, you'll see someone who I'm just very, very honored to work with day in and day out, and that's Dan Ryden. For those of you who don't know Dan, he's been a tour de force in the field of nutrition and infant feeding practices during his career at the NIH. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this was really his inception. He and Don had a phone call, gosh, maybe a year and a half ago, and it was just an honor to see how this developed. So as a general overview, the bond platform and I'll get into Dan's slides in a moment, it stands for the biomarkers of nutrition for development, and that was a platform that had been used successfully in the past. It brought together multiple stakeholders of government and non-government to really hone in on questions that were focused on nutrition. And as Don mentioned, when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden now we were faced with gaps and with close to 400 million children who didn't have access to school, and where all of us, I think, acknowledge and appreciate the importance of the first 1,000 days. The next 7,000 days are pretty important too, and I think that it really lent itself to take the next step to delve into the nutritional needs and assessments of school-age children. Next slide, please. So that really was our goal, was to really address the role of nutrition in child health, looking again, not minimizing at all the importance of the first 1,000 days, but recognizing that during growth and development of these children and adolescents, there's a lot happening, and there's a lot of gaps, and our role at the NIH really is, and one of the joys of my job every day is to think about ways to support the research that can not just inform biology and inform science, but also make a difference. And so going from the top to the bottom on this slide is really to support research, and that really means, to a large extent, bringing together some really bright people, some individuals with different perspectives, different lenses, and really asking the challenging questions. And that's what Bond Kids do. And you'll hear that theme over the next several minutes and during the course of this conversation. What are the key questions? What are the key elements to address? And then how to translate that. Dan, in his work to date, and with many on this panel today, we are very much interested in learning and extending knowledge, but then also translating that knowledge with, as you'll see on the right, with the overall goal of improving health. And one of the joys of working in this space with adolescents and young children is that invariably you kind of get two for one. You get an opportunity to improve the health of the child and the adolescent, and that most often extends to their immediate families, if not extended families, and the community. So it was with that overarching goal that we incepted Bond Kids. Next slide, please. So what are the aspirations? The aspirations, I'm not going to read the slides verbatim, but it really was to provide support for those organizations and those agencies that are on the ground and that we're dealing with these challenges on a day-to-day basis. And really provide support and ask the research questions that were going to be meaningful to them. As Don mentioned, we utilized the Bond platform because it was a platform that had been successful, and so we didn't feel we needed to reinvent the wheel, but rather use the wheel to go in a slightly different direction.
Can anybody hear me?
Oh, and Dan is joining us right now. So I succeeded Dan in starting the show. For those of you on the webinar, this is the gentleman I've just been giving accolades and kudos to. And Dan, I am on your slide 3, but I will finish up and then turn the floor over to Dr. Dan Radin. But again, our goal was really to take this wheel of the Bond platform and move it in a different direction to really meet these unmet needs and address these gaps in the science, with the goal of being non-duplicative but informative, and always with the goal of leveraging what we've learned to be actionable and translatable at the end of the day. And Dan will mention at the end different phases of the Bond Kids program. This is an actionable program that's meant to make a difference. And then before I turn the floor over to my colleague Dan, what we didn't intend to do was to develop guidelines. That's not in our purview, and that's not our charge, but rather our charge at the NIH and NICHD is really to support the best science, to inform those guidelines, and to inform the investigators, inform the policymakers, and inform them with robust scientific evidence. So with that, I've succeeded in kicking off, but I'm even more proud to transition to Dr. Radin to take it from here. So Dan, we are on your slide 4, and it's all yours, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry for the technical glitches. It's the world we live in, I guess. I want to thank the meeting organizers and Don for his introduction, Drew for his support, without which none of this happens, and all of the Bond Kids team. So let's move forward. Next slide. So Drew mentioned, I think, a little bit about what the Bond platform is. For those of you that may not be familiar with Bond, the acronym stands for Biomarkers of Nutrition for Development. It's an initiative that started in 2010 as a collaboration with the Gates Foundation. We held a meeting at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna and really wanted to engage the global community, much like we're trying to do here. It makes no sense to go through these kinds of processes without being able to have some sense of harmony across the agencies. You don't want to have a project that comes out results, then have someone else do a similar project that has different results. That just creates more confusion rather than solving the issues, the complex issues at hand. So Bond was really intended to support the entire global food and nutrition enterprise by providing technical service, reviewing the evidence about what assessment methodologies are best in a given context. And as you noted, we thought that the Bond platform was particularly well suited for this project. We recognize that the global food and nutrition enterprise has a broad continuum of activities that starts with bench science, clinical science, clinicians making diagnosis and care and providing care, those people that are doing surveillance, those folks that are doing programs, implementation, scaling up, rolling out, et cetera. And the data users, which includes policymakers and those people that are making guidelines and recommendations. They're all of us are consuming these data, and it's really important to have some sense of harmony about what data is best for a given context. Next slide. We use a term throughout this project and others we refer to an ecology. And we provide here the sort of a working definition that we're comfortable with regard to what is an ecology. An ecology is the intersection of a complex biological system with its environments. In this case, what we're talking about is the school-age child and their environment. And that environment is both internal, reflecting the biology, genetics, health context, et cetera, and external. Next slide. All of us use the term environment, and I'm not sure we all mean the same thing when we talk about environment. For us, we're trying to be as holistic as possible when we refer to the environment. And these are the components of the environment. It's not just the physical environment, it's the home and family environment, community environment, it's the food system, it's the biological context, et cetera. And obviously social, economic, and political environments. All of these things reflect the environment, and these are critical parts of the ecology. Next slide. So when you look at this ecology, you recognize that there are multiple components to it. This is just a cartoon to represent those multiple components of the internal and the external ecology. Next slide. Next. So, what are the challenges here that we're facing? Essentially, and you guys are all probably have heard about this over the last 4 days, and you're all well familiar with the fact that school-age children represent a continuum of developmental stages. Each of these developmental stages is exquisitely nutritionally sensitive. And so it's really important to be aware of what children are eating and what their biology and how they're utilizing the nutrients that they're consuming. In many places in the US and globally, children are faced with significant food and nutrition insecurity. Our efforts to address those are the focus of these meetings. Those programs that are providing nutritional support to school-age children are critical. And what we're trying to do here is provide the evidence to support our efforts to define the needs of these children across those developmental stages, as well as assess the impact of the programs and interventions that we're providing. Next slide. So the objectives of the Bond Kids project are simply to take a ecological approach to address these problems, viewing the child as a complex biological system and addressing those factors in their environment, both internal and external, that are impacting on their nutritional needs and requirements and their response to the programs that they're receiving. Drew mentioned we have a goal of doing this in 2 phases. The first phase will be an examination of the evidence. This is what we're going to talk about mostly today. That first phase is really focused on the evidence. What is it that we know? What is it that we don't know about the 4 key themes that we're addressing here? The key themes being the biology of the child, the nutrition of the biology of the child, the external environment, those factors that influence the outcomes of interest that we're looking at. How do we put that all together in assessing the needs and impacts of these programs on children? And last but not least is the issue of translation and implementation. We recognize as a biomedical research institute, our job is to develop the evidence, but we also recognize that that evidence needs to be translated in a meaningful way. It needs to be translated into well-informed protocols for interventions, trials for interventions, but it also has to be translated to those people like all of you that are providing support to children, whether in school or in home or whatever the case may be. And that needs to be done in an equitable, context-specific manner. And so that is a major focal point of the theme. The second phase of this, which in essence is one of the goals of this session, is to start that second phase. How do we take this information and move it forward realistically in terms of both research protocols through efforts like those at the London School and the Research Consortium, and through programmatic and supporting program and policy. Next slide. This just briefly describes the organization of the Bond Kids project. We started out with the Secretariat consisting of staff from NICHD and the Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics, our partners, without which none of this happens. I'm going to say that repeatedly. We had a scientific steering committee that consisted of representation from both the US and global health communities, the UN system, and the relevant academic civil society. And then the actual work that you'll hear about today was done by the working groups, which were focused around the 4 themes that we'll discuss a little bit more. Next slide, please. This is just, again, a summary of the organization, giving a shout out in particular to the Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics and our partners in the initiation of this and the continued work of Bond Kids have been, Don and his team with the Research Consortium at the London School, Diane DiBernardo at the USDA Foreign Ag Service, and Allison Steiber and her team at the Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics, and of course, Drew and the team at NICHD. None of this happens without that group. Next slide.
Dan, can I just just say that we're a little tight on time.
I'm finished.
Perfect.
So this is the last, this will be the last slide. This is just summarizing where we are conceptually. We've organized this into 4 working groups. The first working group is represented by that circle of outcomes around nutritional status. Overlapping that is the working group 2, who focus on the environment. That information is then taken and developed more fully by the working group 3 on assessment. And finally, the group that you'll hear from Dr. Economos on with regard to translation implementation. I'll stop there. Thank you. And again, my apologies for the delays.
So super, Dan. That was really helpful to give us a great run through. And I was just thinking to myself that we got you and we got Drew. So this is a real plus, I think, in explaining the background. And we will be going on to questions. So people who put questions into the Q&A, we will, Dan, don't go away, because we will be asking you to be there to respond to those too.
I'm here.
Okay,
I think anybody wanted to see me.
So I'm going to now ask Professor Chris Economos, the Dean of the Friedman School, a Professor of Public Health and Nutrition, Tufts University, and I have to say, the co-chair with me of the working group on translational research. And what a pleasure and privilege it was to work with you, Chris, on that. And Chris is going to give us some insights into the application of the framework that Dan and Drew have just outlined.
Great. Thank you so much, Don, and thank you to Dan and Drew and Allison and everyone who's made the work possible so far and the opportunity to present today. So as Don mentioned, he and I chaired Working Group 4, which, as you saw in a slide that Dan showed, is all about translation and implementation. So I'd love to share today our current thinking on making this work come to life across the globe and some of the factors we think are really important. And this can serve as a model for work that you're doing, and also hopefully in supporting all of this work moving forward as Bond Kids continues to progress and your work across the globe as school meals progresses. So the first thing I wanted to share was the overarching principles that we believe are extremely important to both implementation and translation of this overall framework, and particularly the framework I'll show you in a moment, which is about translation and implementation. So we know that intervention design has to purposely target developmental stages. The work that's been done on the first 1,000 days is extremely important for children and women who are pregnant to get off to a good start. And we now really want to focus on the next 7,000 days and how do we maintain and even grow the health of children as they're moving through their elementary, middle, and high school years, as we refer to them in the US, and reaching adulthood. So planning for developmental stages is extremely important. You'll see some of that in the sites that we highlight. Transdisciplinary science is really what we need to facilitate collaboration and consider biology, ecology, and implementation science. So scientists working together from different disciplines to solve complex problems. That's been a call recently from any funding organization. And those of us who are scientists believe that the best work is done when we work together. Equitable engagement of diverse stakeholders, which fosters inclusion, develops relationships, builds buy-in, and co-creates context-specific customization of interventions. I can't stress this enough. I've worked in urban, rural, suburban environments in the US and even outside the US. And contextually, the factors have to be taken into consideration for adoption and implementation to take place, and most importantly, for any sustainability. A range of contextual drivers, including social, political, racial, historical, and economic, impact the programming. And without a clear understanding of what these contextual drivers are, it's almost impossible to implement something successfully. So this really speaks to the need for social scientists and community stakeholders to be involved in the process, to fully understand what kind of environment you're working in. Policies, interventions, and procedures developed in one setting may not be applicable to another. I've done quite a bit of scale work from my original Shape Up Somerville study in the US and know that there's a core that can be scaled and is important to maintain the integrity of in order to get the dose and effect that you want. But there are layers on top of that, which include these contextual factors that we're describing, which will be very different and really require deep understanding in order to implement that core intervention. And last but not least, building for sustainability includes economic and financial analyses, appropriate fit within existing systems, and flexible adaptation. And I want to make a plug for real-time data collection and analysis. I use a lot of this in my system science work, where you don't wait for 2 years to collect data and then make your decisions, but you're constantly collecting, taking the pulse and analyzing data so that appropriate adaptation can occur and you don't reach the end of an implementation period of perhaps years and realize that it failed. So the more we can use technology for rapid data collection, analysis, and adaptation, the more we'll be able to ensure that implementation in complex systems is efficient. So on the next slide, I want to show you our, I would say, almost final, but not quite, visual of how we envision implementation and translation of some of the core evidence-based programming. So this really shows you indicators that we believe are suitable for use in real-world settings to assess impact of programs and policies designed to reach children 5 to 19 years of age. So starting at the bottom, I spoke already about developmental stages, and we know that depending on the age of the child, the program and the contextual factors will differ, and these need to be taken into consideration. The other working groups that were mentioned focused on biology assessment and environment were all taken into consideration when making this diagram, but I really want to focus on the factors on in the actual center here under food and nutrition interventions, settings, and systems. These are things we really believe are important to measure and understand when you're doing translational work. So starting with the purple, food and nutrition interventions, we know that these will be meals, these will be snacks, these will be supplementation, these will be actual programming that have shown to be effective if done well. But unless we look at things like shelf stability and sustainability and food and nutrition quality and quantity and cost effectiveness and cost benefit, we won't be able to actually measure whether these things are being implemented as designed. In the next layer out in green, this is a really important piece of what will become our chapter or our piece of this. And this is, what do you need to take into consideration within the different settings? And these, of course, would be schools, after-school programs, summer programs, and other environments where you can implement these school programs, particularly school meals in schools. You have to measure and monitor things like reach, the training of the people you're working with, the adoption, the implementation, the distribution, the capacity on the ground, and the equity components. If these things aren't taken into consideration from the beginning, planned for, adapted to, and monitored as you go, it's unlikely that a program will be successful. And then the next layer out in blue, we really think about as systems. And in this case, it's policy, government, health, food systems and agriculture, culture, food safety, et cetera. And within these systems, looking at things like diffusion of innovation, the economic landscape, the conditions for scale and sustainability and political will are things that are really important to measure and monitor. So we know that looking at the endpoint, which is the child, the health of the child, is extremely important. But we also know that we won't get there unless we design programs and use these measures and metrics within the field of implementation and translation to ensure effective implementation and uptake. So I hope this was helpful in thinking about, within a global context, how do we plan for intentional and effective implementation while always maintaining a strong equity lens in the process. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Chris, for that quick overview of what was a very fascinating process. I think we should, I don't know if we've specifically mentioned this, but in March, every Friday in March, there was a 3-hour workshop, and these were all done online, and with about 50 professors actually directly in the discussion each time. It was a remarkable process. And I think you summarized remarkably the way in which that's moved us forward. Okay, so that's given us the background to the Bond Kids, the platform, the thinking, and the beginning, I should say, the tying up of phase 1. And I think there's going to be 5 publications coming out of that will be covering the main issues, and maybe Dan will refer to that a little later. But that's phase 1. But we also talked about phase 2 and how we move forward. And so let's just talk now. Let's hear from two very experienced people to talk about some of the context for this. And let's start with Carmen Burbano, the director for the World Food Programme's work on school meals. And Carmen, would you please give us a sense of your insights about the practical implications of this kind of work for the World Food Programme?
Thank you so much, Don. And I want to appreciate and thank all of the members of the Bond Kids Project and the leadership of Drew and Dan and Christina and yourself. It's so important for us to have such a rigorous partnership with teams that are really looking at this from a scientific point of view. From our perspective, one of the things that I think I would like to bring into this particular discussion is that when we talk about school meals, we are really talking about the largest food assistance program that exists for children in the world. If we look at the scale and the size of these efforts, it's about 388 million children that receive meals each day. That's a huge investment from governments, and the agenda is only growing as the food crisis has taught us that this is a really important safety net for children. The pandemic also taught us how crucial these programs are. So we can expect this agenda to grow and and governments to continue to pour quite a bit of resources because these programs are so cost effective and they have benefits. We've discussed today benefits on nutrition and the environment in which the child is developing and their health status, but they also have benefits across the social protection sector, agriculture sector, and others. So this is an agenda that's very much at the top of a lot of the global discussions these days, and an integral part of finding solutions to some of the thorniest problems that we're dealing with. So in that context, this conversation and the work that's being done by this team is crucially important because even though we have I would say consensus now that the nutrition and the support to school-age children is important, there's a huge gap in terms of how we are looking at this from a very rigorous scientific perspective. When we started to look at this very seriously about 4 years ago, we realized as a UN agency, but also as governments that are really leading on this issue, we have no way of measuring whether our interventions are actually working at the outcome and impact level when it comes to nutrition. We, at the moment, don't have indicators that are globally accepted and as prevalent, for example, as some of the indicators that we use for under fives. The prevalence and the understanding of the world around stunting, around underweight, and some of these measures that can quickly tell us if we're going in the right direction in terms of interventions and policies, we do not have an equivalent of that when it comes to the school age and adolescence. That's a huge gap. It has implications both on how we are assessing the impact of these programs, and Chris was mentioning that as well. We need, and as this agenda continues to move forward, we need more attention on the 7,000 days beyond the first 5 days of 5 years of life. We need to be able to understand how to measure progress, how to measure outcomes, how to measure child's nutritional status, and specifically also with a focus towards a conversation that will come very soon, which is how are we doing in the SDGs? how are we doing in those global goals and what the world decided was the way forward, but also even beyond the SDGs, what happens after 2030? And we are very eager to work with this group and practitioners all over within the context of the coalition and the monitoring and data initiative to figure out how do we fix this? How do we fill this gap? Both for policymakers and for those of us that are implementing these programs on the ground, but also for those that are investing, including donors and including a lot of foundations and philanthropy that are now increasingly investing in these programs. So getting this right is going to be crucial for us as we move forward in the implementation realm.
Great, thank you so much, Carmen, for sharing those insights. And please don't go away, because we will have some questions, and we'd like you to participate in those discussions too. But I'm going to move on now to Bibi Giosi, the senior advisor to the African Union, the African Union Development Agency, and NEPAD on food and nutrition. And Bibi, can I ask you if you would give us some insights or share some of your insights on the practical implications of this work for the African Union's programming work? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. Thank you, Carmen, and the previous speakers. It's interesting because when you are working with a group like this, you feel like you've been a voyeur in giving out some of the information, because I feel like many people may already have an idea of what I might have to say. But aside from that, I think this whole week we have had, a plea, if not a lament, around the issue of lack of or paucity of data and information for it to be utilized at the right time, for the right reasons, with the right people, for the right outcomes and effectiveness. So in this regard, Africa is no exception. We struggled with, first of all, the currency of the data, the availability of the data, and even if the data are there, they are not national representative, let alone regional representative, so that you can compare, region to region or country to country. And then, depending on who collects the data, you may find that, there's always a discrepancy or a disciplinary, as they say in Portuguese. So if a health person is collecting the data, an agriculture person, where do you really smooth out, the kind of methodology? So what BondKids can do from an African perspective and using the platform is to develop, robust and, methodologies and support with data collection that can be interpreted, analyzed, and utilized by not only the policy makers, but the program practitioners. But also, BondKids can help in understanding where the data gaps are and how to, across the key sectors, know what really should be collected and how it should be collected and what kind of utilization is envisaged. So knowing what information and what indicators need to be connected to deepen the knowledge base for dietary sufficiency, because this is where the Achilles heel has been. Do we know what children are eating? Do we know what adolescents are eating? Both in the school setting, but extending that to the home setting. If we collect information and data from a clinic setting before children even go to school, how do we then understand that gap so that, when they transition to kindergarten and to school, we know how we should be feeding them effectively. And then also working with the local research and academic institutions, for me, remains very important, because unless they are brought on board to build their own capacity, to be able to analyze, interpret, and monitor the usage of this information going forward remains very critical. And from the interpreted data and information, how do we craft workable policies? How do we ensure timely messaging for different end users? And talking of end users, moving from the lab of research to implementation science, as was just presented by the previous speaker. So it is going to be critical for us as we scientists think about where the rubber hits the tarmac, the usability of this information, and then also to help in coordinating with other sectors and players, in somewhat harmonizing a number of things, e.g. terminology. Are we speaking the same language? Or understanding and unpacking the very questions that we are wanting to work with. What does nutrition look like to a health practitioner, to an ag economist, to an agricultural producer, to a farmer, to a social protection, to a gender, youth, and all these things, And then, it's really a case of asking a blind man, what does an elephant look like or feel like? Depending on which part they're touching, it is going to be very different. So we as scientists in different realms have to fully understand that an elephant is a whole animal. Hence, our approach should be holistic. Understand that we are dealing with a systemic, or we should be dealing with through a systemic approach. And then for the research and data to be available to the country, school meals and related practitioners and bond keys to help, to translate the complicated scientific babble, if I may call it that, into chewable morsels that anybody can really understand and can really see themselves in the whole process, in the whole value chain of, effectively, impactfully and sustainably applying such, information. And last but not least, I think we should, really dig into the science of tracking, monitoring the processes and the progress thereof in the bid to achieve for Africa, not only the Malabo targets, but also the Africa Year of Nutrition, which is going to be hopefully extended into 2023 and beyond, and then the SDGs and the Agenda 2063. So we have a lot of work, cut for us. So let's land running. Over to you, Dan.
Wow, that's a challenging list, but a very helpful one, I think, in framing the way we need to think going forward. Now we have an opportunity now to take a few questions, and I'd like to start off. Actually, I'm going to ask Dan if he can help us a little here, just to let us know what are the next steps from phase one. I know there's a publication process envisaged. What are we going to hear from phase one?
Well, thanks, Don. First, I didn't have an opportunity to recognize the folks that were responsible for the other working groups, and I just want to acknowledge the chairs of the 4 working groups. You've heard from Chris and Don. The other working groups are the biology work group, which is chaired by Connie Weaver at San Diego State University. The second group is chaired by Maureen Black of the University of Maryland and RTI. And the third group is chaired by Saurabh Mehta at Cornell University. Without their leadership, none of this happens. So the answer to the question is, the groups are working diligently to pull their reports together. They will be published in the American Journal of, the Journal of Nutrition as soon as we can get them out. And then we will go through a process of dissemination. We would like to get this, the papers will all be open access, available as broadly as we can make them. We will disseminate them however we can. And we will continue to work with our partners, the Research Consortium and A&D. Alison Steiber and her team are tremendous, and her community is really critical in moving this agenda forward. The dietetic community are the folks, the boots on the ground, as it were, for really interfacing between the science and the clinical care. So our efforts will be that, focus on that, getting the papers out, disseminating them broadly. To the extent that we might have a research programmatic activities, that remains to be seen. It's always a question of funding, but we will work with our constituent communities who do research to try and develop applications and move this agenda forward, fill some of the gaps that have been identified. So thanks.
Super, thank you very much for that. And just to underline the importance of those working group leaders in taking this forward, and to underline that was the beginning of a process which is now becoming much more global. So it's that was great. So the question I want us to pursue, and I'm going to address it to 3 of you actually, is about selecting nutrition indicators. We heard from Carmen Burbano about the creation of a new data and monitoring initiative that's going to be a long-term, a continuous look at data in this area for school-age children and adolescents. I'm going to ask Dan, if you could just talk us through a little bit about what you think we've learned about selecting nutrition indicators for these age groups. Drew, I'd like you to just touch on the importance of the different age groups in terms of those indicators. And Chris, if I could ask you to talk about the sort of systems science messages about collecting data and the real-time data collection. If I could ask you just to touch on those issues, that would be great. Dan.
Good question. And so I'll start off. I will admit to being uncomfortable with the term indicator. The terms that we generally use from a public health point of view, whether it's dailies or whatever the case may be, even indicators like stunting and anemia are not sensitive and specific to nutrition. They are, sort of indicators of perturbations in the system, but it really doesn't give us a lot of information with regard to what's going on. So when we talked about the bond project, that was part of the issue with the bond project that we were trying to address is, what's the terminology? What's the expectation? So biomarkers are sensitive and specific. They're biological generally. If you put them together with bioindicators, something like hemoglobin, which indicates a perturbation in hematology, you can put the biomarkers of specific nutrient or multiple nutrient status together with a bioindicator. You get some indication of not just the nutritional status and where that person is with regard to the nutrients of interest, but also the functional implications of that status. So that's really a critical piece of this. The other piece of this that will be a focus of working group 3 in assessment is precision of assessment, and precision of assessment both clinically, because ultimately we're dealing with people and individuals, and in surveillance. The real challenge that we have from a public health point of view is how do we improve the precision of the surveillance that we're doing? What can we include in things like the demographic and health surveys, in the United States, the NHANES survey. We have lots of examples of that kind of surveillance, but how can we improve the precision of that to get a better idea of what's really going on, both in terms of nutritional status, as well as the function of the populations that we're interested in exploring. I hope that was useful.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Is Drew still with us? I'm just checking.
Unfortunately for you, I still am. you can't shake me that easily, Don. No, but to pick up on where Dan left off, and then Don to address your question about age ranges. This is something actually that all 4 of the working groups actually spent quite a bit of time on at the very inception of On Kids as we were thinking about our charges. Is how really to make these assessments. Dan says frequently that our line of research and science is not one size fits all, and that's extraordinarily applicable to the pediatric population. And that's one of the joys of being a pediatrician is watching and being a part of families' lives, but watching children grow up. And so the biology is fascinating, and there's in this range of the next 7,000 days, there's so much growth and development that occurs, and each child is different, each sex is different. There are so many, going back to Dan's point about the ecology, the exposures and the ecological environment for these children and the young adolescents is extraordinarily different, and then trying to make assessments really are age and sex, very are relevant. And so whether it be measuring height velocity, growth velocity, and statural growth in a 4 or 5-year-old versus degrees of sexual maturation in a 12 or 13-year-old, all those are very much interlinked and are involved. And so, with the Bond Kids project, what we tried to, one of the many charges was how to comment and opine on nutritional needs and assessments, depending on the degree of sexual maturation and physical maturation, and depending on the sex. And so it's challenging, but I think it reinforces the concept that children are not little adults, and that their biology matters, and making assessments in the context of their biology is very important. And so I get that long-winded, maybe hopefully a semi-answer, but it really is, context is so relevant in this age range, and making assessments and trying to make inferences about needs really has to be done, in my opinion, in the context of the physical development of the child.
Super, and I think there's no apology needed for being long-winded, because the point is, it is really complex, isn't it? 7,000 days is a long time. This is 5 to 20 years of age. So much happens and changes during that phase. Those of us who are parents think could think of that as a major journey. So it's no surprise that we need to think of these young people as different sorts of human beings at those different phases. So I think that's a very helpful response. Chris, can I turn to you for the question on the system science approach?
Sure. Thanks, Don. I'll answer it in two different ways. The first is really to understand context. And, there's a suite of tools within the system science toolbox that enable people to do community-based system dynamics, to really understand what's going on the ground, and what a community, which could be defined as a community of place or a community of identity, really are dealing with in terms of structures and drivers and barriers and enablers, et cetera. And for a group of people to go through group model building, for example, to work together to build that model of what's going on in their space, really identifies what needs to be taken into consideration for effective implementation. So you can surface barriers, you can surface capacity needs, you can surface time delays, and that really can only be done by people in that environment. Someone working in an office 1,000 miles away can make some assumptions, but until you really get on the ground and do that work with stakeholders who will be implementing the intervention, it's very hard to predict what might get in the way. So that's one way that we use system science to do group model building like activities, and really perform community-based system dynamics to understand the flow of information and the diffusion of how these types of programs get taken up and implemented. And you can sometimes head off unintended consequences, and you can lower the barriers if you identify them early on. The second thing is with respect to measures we collect in the process of implementation. And those are related to, for example, the RE-AIM framework, which looks at reach and effectiveness and adoption, implementation, and maintenance or sustainability. And again, just measuring things at the end doesn't tell you a lot about what happened during the process. So there are lots of quick measures that can be done during implementation. And I'll use reach for an example. At the beginning, you might know how many children you're intending to deliver a program to, but without monitoring that on a daily or weekly basis, you don't really know what your reach is and what the fall off is. And if there are patterns of fall off, that you can then look deeper to see why. Why are children coming at the beginning of the month and not the end of the month? Just as an example. What's going on? What are the drivers that are happening in that particular context? Are children working? Are they being kept home for different reasons? So those are really important. And if you're not collecting the data on an ongoing basis with I would say, sophisticated technology system that enables you to look at that regularly, you won't really know what's going on underneath. There are lots of ways with digital capture to look at what's being served and what's being consumed. We can do plate waste, which is labor intensive. We can also use digital photography to see, you implement a school meals program and you see the volume of food going out, what's left on the plate at the end. Photography can give you a pretty good sense of quantity, and you can also start to look deeply at quality. So I'm suggesting that there are lots of measures that can be done on a regular basis to look at the rollout of implementation and give us real-time measures of what's happening and make adaptations as we go. So those are just two examples. And I would note within the RE-AIM framework, a lot of those measures can be modeled. And so if you put them into a larger complex model, you can get a sense of what some of the indicators are that lead to success. And I think more importantly, what are the variables that are getting in the way of the success long-term? So I'm arguing for absolutely looking at the child and the effectiveness in the long-term on biology. Are we delivering the nutrients we want to and seeing growth and development appropriately? But we're not going to get to that delivery unless we look at the systems of implementation and the complexity of those across the globe, and we start to measure and monitor what's going on.
That's great. Thank you,
Don,
Chris.
can I just add a quick point that we really haven't emphasized here, and that is that none of this is linear. We tend to think of things in linear terms, but really is a continual feedback loop. So all of these things, these indicators, biomarkers, bioindicators, are constantly being collected and need to be collected so that we can determine whether there's unforeseen consequences to the interventions, or not just whether or not we're succeeding, but are there unintended consequences. So there's a continual feedback loop. It's really circular and not linear.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Dan. And I mean, anyone using a systems lens to think about their work, even if it's traditional, clinical trials, if you can think about it in more of a systems way with feedback loops and circular, it's much better because you don't miss a lot of the, I'll call them nuances, but they're certainly larger than that happen during implementation and during growth. So thank you for mentioning that.
Super. And that's, I think one of the things that I certainly learned from the Shape Up Somerville piece of work, actually, Chris, that you led on, was how complex these questions are, and that complexity needs to be captured in the response as well. That's the other big thing that I took from that was actually these programs really can deal with address issues like obesity. These programs do work. And the evidence becomes very convincing in those kinds of complex systematic studies. Time has caught up with us, I'm afraid, but I'm going to ask actually Bibi and Carmen to take us out, as it were, on this. We've not talked about phase 2 in any great detail, so I'm just going to ask you for a one-liner really about that. I'm going to ask Bibi first if she can just tell us, is phase 2, in other words, translating these thoughts now into some actions? Do we have opportunities within Africa, perhaps amongst the nutrition societies, within the economic groups to take forward those ideas? And I'm going to ask the same question of Carmen in the context really of thinking about the data and monitoring initiative that the World Food Programme is supporting. Sorry to make it so short, but.
No, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Don. Of course, there are ample opportunities, to take this work forward in phase 2. However, I would like to also just nuance my response with a question that always tugs at my heartstrings as to how do we address in the whole, gamut of science, the notion of positive deviance. We've seen and we know that, despite, the environments, similar, you find that, there are communities that are performing better, schools that are performing better, families, and even children. I'm reminded of the case of the young children in the Bushman of the Kalahari. I've never seen a malnourished child there, in spite of the very harsh environment. What can we learn from these kinds of very unique circumstances using the Bond Kids model going forward, so that we are not just, putting a blanket approach to everything, but we can really be specific and very sensitive about measurement. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Carmen.
Don, thank you. And yes, as the last intervention, I think, and also putting my WFP hat on for us, I've been listening to this whole discussion, understanding the richness of the analysis and the already everything we have from this extraordinary group of scientists and brains. I think there's an enormous potential for us to take this forward, particularly within the data and monitoring initiative of the coalition, the work that we're going to be doing with governments on really translating some of this into practice. I just want to add that one of the things that we absolutely need to be looking at in phase 2 is how do we do this in low resource, low capacity settings? So understanding that, one thing is applying this in a high income setting, in a high capacity setting where you have a Ministry of Health, where you have you have schools to begin with, right? You have environments that are actually even there. Another is implementing this in low-income settings, particularly fragile countries, where those are the most vulnerable children. Those are the ones that we're actually most concerned with. But we do have limitations in terms of how these approaches can be translated into those real-world situations. So that would be my plea at the moment in terms of thinking about next steps, is this needs to be translatable in those contexts in which we really do have a lot of limitations.
Fantastic, a sobering thought, and but exactly the way forward. Question that's been asked is this being recorded? Yes, all of these sessions are being recorded. They're also being summarized, so you can catch up on ones you've missed, and you can also revisit. I'm going to finish with a quote from Dan, who's been our leader in all of this and who we all deeply respect. Dan said, "Children pass through multiple stages at school age and adolescence, and that each of these developmental stages is exquisitely sensitive to nutrition." That's the big message for us. Thank you so much for joining this call. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.